Welcome to the Pursuit Chronicles, where hidden truths, bold journeys, and untold stories come to life. Get ready to chase the extraordinary. The elderly man stepped into the courtroom in handcuffs, his weathered face downcast. Name? The clerk asked. He answered in a trembling voice, Mason Quinn, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. No one expected what happened next. Minutes later, as the female judge reviewed his file, she suddenly froze, her face draining of color. That name belonged to the man who had saved her brother's life on the battlefield of Fallujah before making the ultimate sacrifice. Type respect. If you believe honor doesn't fade just because we grow poor or old, Mason Quinn, 69, sat on the courtroom bench, his shoulders slumped beneath a faded military jacket 2 sizes too large. The harsh fluorescent lights accentuated deep lines carved by time and hardship across his once proud face. Decades ago he'd stood tall in dress blues, medals gleaming on his chest. Today he waited for judgment in clothes acquired from a shelter donation bin. The bailiff called his case Number Docket 47B, City v. Mason Quinn, disturbance of peace, trespassing, resisting arrest. Mason shuffled forward, his movements stiff from arthritis and old injuries that had never properly healed. Vietnam. First, then Iraq for his second tour, wounds visible and invisible, all carried silently through the decades since. Mr. Quinn, began the prosecutor, a young man with perfect teeth in a tailored suit, has been repeatedly warned about loitering behind the Jefferson Street Cafe. The owner has filed 3 complaints this month alone. What the prosecutor didn't mention was that Mason had only been sitting quietly near the cafe's dumpster, warming himself by the kitchen exhaust vent on particularly cold nights. He never panhandled, never bothered customers, just sought a moment's warmth when December. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Officer James Reynolds, who had made the arrest, testified next. Found the defendant behind the cafe at 11:45 p.m. He refused to vacate the premises when instructed. Mason hadn't refused, he'd simply asked for 5 more minutes to finish the half sandwich the cook had secretly given him. But arguing seemed pointless now, as it had then. Your Honor, the prosecutor continued, this is the defendant's 3rd citation this year. We recommend community service and a 30-day no trespass order for the downtown business district. A no trespass order would mean no access to the shelter on 4th Street, the only warm bed Mason had known in months. It would mean no meals at St. Luke's Church on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It would mean true isolation in the coldest part of winter. Mr. Quinn, Judge Olivia Parker addressed him directly, do you have representation today? Mason shook his head. The public defender assigned to him had been called to another courtroom for an emergency hearing. Would you like to make a statement on your own behalf? The judge asked, peering over half-moon reading glasses. Mason cleared his throat, his voice rusty from disuse. No excuses, Your Honor, just trying to stay warm. Any particular reason you chose that location? The judge pressed, something unreadable flickering across her stern features. The cook, Mason hesitated. Jimmy, sometimes leaves food. Known him since he was a kid. His father served with me in Desert Storm. And your military service? Judge Parker asked, though this information wasn't typically relevant in such proceedings. United States Marine Corps, 1975 to 1995, Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines in Iraq. The words came automatically, a moment of clarity and pride. Amid confusion, the judge made a note, then continued reviewing the file. Something in Mason's personnel record seemed to catch her attention. Before she could speak again, the courtroom doors opened. A distinguished man in an expensive suit entered. Approaching the public defender's table, he placed a leather briefcase down and addressed the court. Your Honor, Alexander Rossi for the defendant. I apologize for the interruption, but I've been retained to represent Mr. Quinn. Mason looked up in confusion. He hadn't called anyone. Couldn't afford a lawyer, especially not one with a suit. That expensive. This is highly irregular, Mr. Rossi, Judge Parker noted. The court was not informed of this representation. It's a very recent development, Your Honor, Rossi replied smoothly. I would request a brief recess to confer with my client, Judge Parker studied the lawyer, then Mason, her expression unreadable. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," she announced, rising suddenly as she disappeared into her chambers. Mason turned to the stranger beside him. "I don't have money for a lawyer." "You don't need any," Rossi replied quietly. "The firm of Williams, Rossi and Parker is handling your case pro bono." Mason frowned at the familiar name. "Parker, like the judge?" "Exactly like the judge," Rossi confirmed. In her chambers, Judge Olivia Parker removed her glasses with trembling hands. 20 years on the bench had taught her to maintain composure, regardless of what appeared before her court, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. "It can't be the same man," she whispered to herself, though the details aligned too perfectly. She unlocked her desk drawer and removed a worn photograph, herself as a young woman standing beside her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, in his Marine dress uniform. His arm was around her shoulders, both smiling widely at his commissioning ceremony. Jack's last letter home from Iraq sat beside the photo, the paper thin from countless readings. In it, he described a firefight outside Fallujah, where his unit had been pinned down by insurgent fire. "If not for Staff Sergeant Quinn," Jack had written, "none of us would have made it out. He ran across open ground under heavy fire to reach a fallen Marine, then provided covering fire so we could evacuate our wounded." 2 weeks after writing that letter, Jack had been killed by an IED. Olivia remembered the military funeral, the folded flag presented to her parents, and the Marine who had approached them afterward. "Your son saved my life," he'd said. "I was the one he pulled to safety before—" The Marine hadn't finished the sentence, didn't need to. That Marine's name had been Mason Quinn. Olivia had tried contacting him after the funeral, wanting to hear more about her brother's final days, but the military had explained that Sergeant Quinn had been deployed again immediately. Later inquiries revealed he'd been honorably discharged after suffering severe PTSD and a traumatic brain injury during his final tour. And now, 20 years later, he sat in her courtroom, homeless, alone, and unrecognized. A knock at the door interrupted her. Thoughts. Alexander Rossi entered, his expression concerned. "Olivia, what's going on?" he asked as her late husband's former law partner and family friend. He was one of the few people who addressed her by her first name. "It's him, Alex," she replied, gesturing to the photograph. "The Marine who saved Jack, the one who carried Jackson out under fire after he was wounded." Rossi's eyes widened as he connected the dots. "The homeless veteran in your courtroom, is that Mason Quinn, the one you've been trying to locate for years?" Olivia nodded. "His service record confirms it. Fallujah 2004, same unit as Jack, awarded the Silver Star for the action Jack described in his letters. Does he know who you are?" "I don't think so. I married Thomas after law school, changed my name to Parker, and it's been 20 years. She paused, collecting herself. "What happened to him, Alex? How does a decorated Marine end up homeless and in my courtroom for trying to stay warm?" Rossi shook his head. "From what I could gather in our brief conversation, he suffered from severe PTSD after his final tour. His wife left while he was deployed. VA benefits got tangled in bureaucracy. He worked construction for years until injuries from his service made physical labor impossible. The rest followed the typical pattern: job loss, foreclosure, and eventually the streets." Olivia closed her eyes, remembering her brother's words. "Quinn is the best of us, the kind who would give everything for his Marines without a second thought. If I'm half the officer he is as an NCO, I'll consider myself successful." "What are you going to do?" Rossi asked gently. "You could recuse yourself?" "No," Olivia replied firmly. "I'm not letting him slip away again. You know there are ethical considerations here." "I'm well aware," she straightened, her judge's demeanor returning. "But there are also ethical considerations in how we treat those who sacrificed everything for our country." When Judge Parker returned to the courtroom, her posture was impeccable, her expression neutral. Yet those who knew her well might have noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she arranged papers before her. "Mr. Rossi, has your client decided how he wishes to proceed?" she asked formally. The attorney stood. "Your Honor, we request dismissal of all charges." My client was simply seeking shelter from dangerously cold conditions, a basic human necessity. Furthermore, we can demonstrate that Mr. Quinn had implied permission from restaurant employees to be on the premises. The prosecutor began to object, but Judge Parker raised her hand slightly, silencing him before ruling. "I have several questions for the defendant." She turned her attention to Mason. "Mr. Quinn, your military record indicates service in Fallujah during 2004. Is that correct?" Mason straightened slightly, muscle memory from decades of military bearing briefly overcoming his current condition. "Yes, Your Honor. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines." "And on April 17, 2004, were you involved in an operation near the western outskirts of the city?" Confusion crossed Mason's weathered face. "Yes, ma'am. We were escorting a convoy when we came under heavy fire. During that engagement," the judge continued, her voice remarkably steady, "did you rescue a wounded Marine, a Lieutenant Jack Parker, while under enemy fire?" The courtroom fell silent. Mason's eyes narrowed, memories visibly washing over him. "Lieutenant Parker," he repeated slowly. "Yes, young officer, good man. He was hit trying to reach a wounded corpsman." Mason's eyes grew distant. "I got to him, pulled him behind a wall. He kept telling me to leave him, to get the others out first." In the gallery, a silver-haired man in a Marine Corps League jacket leaned forward, suddenly intent on the proceedings. "And what happened to Lieutenant Parker?" Judge Olivia Parker asked, her professional mask firmly in place despite the tumult beneath. "We got him to the medevac," Mason replied, his voice dropping. "I heard later he made it to Germany. Then a few weeks after, he was on patrol again. His vehicle hit an IED." Mason's voice cracked slightly. "All these years, I've wondered if I'd done more damage than good, getting him out only for him to die later." The silver-haired Marine in the gallery stood up, unable to contain himself. "That's him," he announced loudly. "That's Staff Sergeant Quinn. I was there that day. He saved 6 of us." Judge Parker struck her gavel once sharply. "Order!" she commanded, though her voice lacked its usual authoritativeness. The courtroom quieted, tension humming in the air. Mason Quinn stared at the floor, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. The silver-haired Marine remained standing, defiant. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, "while Mr. Quinn's military service is admirable, it has no bearing on—" "The court disagrees," Judge Parker interrupted. "It has every bearing." She set her gavel down deliberately. "This court will—" "Take a 10-minute recess. Bailiff, please ensure Mr. Quinn remains in the courtroom." As she rose to leave, she paused, making unprecedented eye contact with the defendant. "Mr. Quinn, when I return, there are matters beyond these charges we need to discuss." In her chambers once more, Olivia's professional composure finally cracked. She pressed trembling fingers against her lips, suppressing emotions that had waited 2 decades for release. After several deep breaths, she reached for her phone. "Colonel Matthews, Olivia Parker. Yes, I know it's been years. Listen, I need a favor, and I need it immediately." When Judge Parker returned exactly 10 minutes later, she was not alone. Behind her walked 3 uniformed Marines, a full colonel, a master sergeant, and a corporal carrying a polished wooden case. The courtroom stirred, whispers racing through the gallery. Mason Quinn stood reflexively at the sight of the uniforms, muscle memory overriding his physical discomfort. Judge Parker took her seat and faced the crowded room. For the first time in her judicial career, she removed her glasses completely, setting them aside to address the court not as a judge, but as a human being. "Before proceeding, I must disclose a matter of personal connection to this case," she began. "The Lieutenant Jack Parker mentioned by the defendant was my brother." A wave of murmurs swept the courtroom. Mason's eyes widened, recognition and confusion battling across his face. 20 years ago, my brother wrote to our family about a staff sergeant who saved his life in Fallujah, a man who ran through enemy fire to reach him after he was wounded and who provided covering fire so others could reach safety." Her voice remained remarkably steady. "That man was Sergeant Mason Quinn." The silver-haired Marine from the gallery called out, "It's true, Your Honor. I was there. Quinn got hit twice pulling the lieutenant to cover." Judge Parker nodded in acknowledgement. 2 weeks after that incident, my brother was killed in action. At his funeral, several Marines approached our family to share stories of Jack's courage, but also to tell us about the staff sergeant who had saved him during that earlier firefight, giving our family 2 more weeks with Jack that we wouldn't otherwise have had. She looked directly at Mason. Now, after my brother's death, I tried to locate you, Sergeant Quinn. The Marine Corps informed me you'd been redeployed immediately. Years later, they told me you had been discharged but couldn't share your location. Mason stood perfectly still, his weathered face a mask of conflicting emotions. I never stopped looking, Judge Parker continued. And now, by what can only be described as fate or divine intervention, you appear in my courtroom. She gestured to the colonel, who stepped forward. Colonel James Matthews was my brother's commanding officer. He has something to say. Colonel Matthews approached the bench. Staff Sergeant Quinn, the Marine Corps has been attempting to locate you for several years. Your file was among thousands flagged for review under the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative. New information came to light regarding your service in Iraq and Afghanistan that warranted reassessment of your decorations and benefit status. The corporal stepped forward, opening the wooden case he carried. Inside gleamed a medal on a blue ribbon. By order of the Secretary of the Navy, and in recognition of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action on April 17, 2004, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Mason J. Quinn, United States Marine Corps. A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, intelligence that remained classified until recently, confirmed that your actions that day not only saved Lieutenant Parker and 5 other Marines, but disrupted an ambush that would have likely destroyed the entire convoy, Colonel Matthews explained. Your Silver Star has been upgraded accordingly. Mason's stoic expression finally broke. There's some mistake, he said hoarsely. I was just doing my job. No mistake, Sergeant, the colonel confirmed, and this is long overdue. From the gallery, a voice called out, Attention on deck! The silver-haired Marine and several others in the courtroom, those with military bearing recognizable even in civilian clothes, rose to attention, rendering salutes to Mason Quinn. One by one, others in the courtroom stood as well until every person present was on their feet. Even the prosecutor, caught between protocol and human decency, rose with evident respect. Judge Parker, tears now flowing freely, addressed the court in an unsteady voice. In light of these circumstances, all charges against Staff Sergeant Mason Quinn are dismissed with prejudice. She struck her gavel with finality. This court stands adjourned. As the formalities concluded, the Master Sergeant approached Mason with a tablet. Sir, we've been trying to locate you to process your corrected VA benefits. Your disability rating has been reassessed at 100% service-connected, retroactive to your discharge date. What does that mean? Mason asked, still overwhelmed. It means substantial back pay, sir, and full medical coverage, housing allowance, and education benefits should you wish to use them, Alexander Rossi stepped forward, and our firm will ensure all of this is processed immediately, Mr. Quinn. No more bureaucratic delays. From the back of the courtroom, Jimmy, the cook who had been leaving food for Mason, approached with tears in his eyes. My dad always said there was a Marine who saved his whole unit, said, if I ever met a Mason Quinn, I owed him everything. He extended his hand. Never realized it was you all this time. The prosecutor, visibly moved, approached Mason as well. Sir, I had no idea. Please accept my apology for how this matter was handled. Mason stood amid the sudden attention, dignity returning to his posture moment by moment, as though the weight of unacknowledged honor had been lifted from his shoulders. Judge Parker descended from the bench, professional distance abandoned. She stopped before Mason, her voice soft but clear. My brother wrote that you told him something when you pulled him to safety. You said no Marine gets left behind while I'm breathing. Today, Sergeant Quinn, we finally fulfill that same promise to you. 2 weeks later, Mason Quinn stood before a mirror in an apartment he still couldn't believe was his. The Veterans. A Fair's housing program had expedited his case, placing him in a 1-bedroom unit in a complex specifically designed for formerly homeless veterans. The walls were sparse, but for one frame, his newly awarded Navy Cross in a display case alongside his original Purple Hearts and service medals that Alexander Rossi had somehow recovered from a storage unit auctioned off years ago. A knock at The door interrupted his thoughts. Judge Olivia Parker stood in the hallway, out of her judicial robes and carrying a small box. "May I come in, Sergeant Quinn?" she asked. Mason ushered her inside, still uncomfortable with his sudden change in circumstances. "Please, just Mason is fine, Your Honor." "Then I'm just Olivia," she replied with a small smile, "at least outside my courtroom." They sat in the small living area, the awkwardness of their unique connection hanging between them. "I brought something." "I thought you might want to see," Olivia said, opening the box and removing a bundle of letters. "These are from Jack. He wrote our family every week while deployed." She handed one to Mason. "This one mentions you specifically. It was written the day after you saved him." Mason's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. Lieutenant. Parker's handwriting was neat, precise, just as Mason remembered from field reports. "Mom and Dad," he read aloud, "don't worry about what you're hearing on the news. I'm safe, thanks to one of my NCOs. Staff Sergeant Quinn did something yesterday I still can't believe. When our unit was hit, he moved through fire that should have dropped anyone. He wouldn't leave me, even when I ordered him to," said no Marine. "Gets left behind on his watch." Mason's voice faltered. "He wrote about you often," Olivia said softly. "Said you were the kind of Marine he aspired to be." "He was a good officer," Mason replied. "Young, but he cared about his men. That's rare." "After we lost Jack, I went to law school," Olivia said. "All of this, the Veterans Court program I started, the housing initiative, it began because of what Jack wrote about you, about how the system fails even its heroes sometimes." Mason looked away, uncomfortable with such recognition. "I'm no hero, just did what needed doing." "That's what heroes always say," Olivia replied gently. She hesitated, then continued. "There's something else you should know. The day Jack died, he was leading a patrol to find an insurgent cell that had been targeting civilians. He volunteered for the mission. His last letter home said he was trying to live up to the example you set." This revelation hit Mason harder than any physical blow. For 20 years he'd carried the weight of survivors' guilt, wondering if saving the lieutenant had only prolonged the inevitable, questioning if his efforts had been meaningless. In the chaos of war, "He didn't die because of you, Mason," Olivia said, seeming to read his thoughts. "He lived the way he did because of you." They sat in silence, two people connected by loss and honor across the decades. Outside, snow began falling gently, blanketing the city in hushed white. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years on the street, I kept thinking nobody remembered, that it all meant nothing in the end." "It meant everything," Olivia assured him. "To Jack, to those other Marines, to me." As she prepared to leave, Olivia placed a hand gently on Mason's shoulder. "Jack always said that the measure of a Marine isn't what they do when everyone's watching, but what they do when no one is. You lived that truth, even when the world looked away." Mason stood straighter than he had in years, a silent dignity returning to his bearing. "Someone remembered my name," he said simply. "After all this time, someone remembered." In that quiet moment, something long broken began to heal, not just for Mason Quinn, but for all those touched by his unrecognized honor. Some people save, others from death, but spend a lifetime with no one to save them from being forgotten. Honor doesn't require glory. Sometimes just a moment of recognition is enough to help someone stand tall again. Thanks for watching the Pursuit Chronicles. If the story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the pursuit never ends.